The galaxy does not whisper, it screams. Across the endless void, beneath the dying light of ancient stars, billions of lives are consumed daily by war, hunger, and the slow grinding machinery of empire. Yet, even among the countless horrors that define existence in the 41st millennium, few fates are as pitiful, as broken, or as quietly damned as that of the Chaos Cultist. They are the forgotten shadows, the trembling mortals who give their breath and blood to powers they scarcely understand, lured by whispers that promise freedom but deliver only chains. Their lives are short, their deaths often unmarked, their very souls consumed in bargains struck with gods who see them as less than dust. To live as a cultist is to stand on the edge of a great abyss, knowing it will one day swallow you whole, but still clutching at its darkness with desperate fingers because the light of the Imperium never offered you warmth. If you find yourself compelled by the darker corners of the Imperium, drawn into the secrets whispered by cults in the underhives and the tragedies of those who bend their knees to ruin, I ask that you remain with me. Support this exploration. Share these stories with others who hunger for truth, and let your voice echo through the void by joining our fellowship. In doing so, you help this chronicle grow stronger, so that more may hear the tales the Imperium dares not speak aloud. Now, let us descend together into the abyss of corruption and need, to witness the dark reality of a Chaos Cultist's existence. The underhive never sleeps, but it does groan. It breathes in a rhythm of rust and decay, as if the entire city above presses its boot heel down into the bones of those who dwell below. The air is a broth of ash, promethium smoke, and the sweet, sick tang of rot, thick enough that every breath is a labor. You taste metal in your mouth. You taste filth. The walls sweat with condensation that drips in slow, mocking rhythm, the water so foul it stains your tongue with oil. No one remembers a day when the air was clean here. No one believes such a day ever existed. It is here, in this forgotten labyrinth beneath the manufactorums, where the lowest strata of humanity cling to existence. Entire generations are born beneath crumbling pipes and die without ever glimpsing the light of the sun. Or if they do, it is only through the haze of smog that paints the sky a permanent iron gray. Children learn to scavenge before they can speak. Their lullabies are the clatter of chains and the distant thrum of plasma reactors. And for the men and women forced into the service of the manufactorum lords, life is measured not in years, but in the steady ticking down of hours their bodies can endure before exhaustion claims them. The Imperium calls this duty. The priests call it sacrifice. But to those who labor here, it is only slow death. Workers shuffle through the colossal gates of manufactura, their eyes hollow, their hands blistered raw from endless toil. They stand before furnaces so hot they sear skin in minutes, crafting the munitions, the armor plates, the weapons that fuel the Imperium's wars across the stars. They are told it is holy work, that each las cell pressed, each round hammered, is a hymn of loyalty to the God Emperor on Terra. Yet none of them have ever seen Terra. None of them have ever heard the Emperor's voice. The only voices they hear belong to taskmasters shouting through vox grills, or the echo of bones breaking when quotas are not met. It is no wonder that despair finds purchase here. When your every breath is pain, when your every hour is chained to a machine that devours your flesh, you begin to wonder if the Emperor has forgotten you, or perhaps, worst still, you begin to suspect he remembers you not at all. Some whisper it in silence, that the Aquila stamped on their overseer's badge is nothing more than an iron bird with wings clipped, incapable of flight. These whispers are dangerous. To speak them out loud is to invite the arbitrator's shock mauls or the flensing knives of the ecclesiarch. A child once asked his mother why they prayed before their shift began, kneeling in the filth, pressing their foreheads to rusted decking plates, while the overseer recited litanies into a vox-cracked microphone. The mother hushed him, terror in her eyes, for even the curiosity of youth can damn an entire family. But in her heart she wondered the same. She had knelt for 20 years, lips bleeding from prayer, and still her rations grew thinner, her body weaker. The Emperor's light was said to shine across the galaxy, but down here beneath the hive, no such light reached them. Only shadow, only smoke. And then, as if the hive itself conspired to answer such doubts, the whispers came. At first they were faint, nothing more than rumors carried by drunks and scavengers, stories of hidden gatherings in the tunnels beyond the sewage outflows, where men and women met not to kneel before the Aquila, but before other symbols. Symbols older, hungrier, alive in ways no imperial creed could ever admit. A cracked circle daubed in blood, a spiral painted in ashes, a rune carved into a wall that seemed to pulse faintly when the glow globes flickered. The desperate said it was nonsense. The fearful said it was heresy. But the hopeless began to listen. For what is heresy to one who already believes they are damned? What is treason to one who feels betrayed? These whispers do not promise salvation. That is not how they work. They promise only that the pain might end, that hunger might dull, that the overseer's lash might no longer bite into your flesh, because soon he will be on his knees beside you, his blood running on the same altar where yours once fell. Such promises are not shouted, they are breathed, as though the hive itself sighs with them. In the sleepless hours of the long shifts, a worker might think they hear a voice humming beneath the thrum of the machines. In the dark of the hab block, someone might glimpse words scratched into a wall that they could swear were not there before. Soon desperation outweighs fear. A handful of workers vanished into the tunnels at night. Some never return, and their absence is chalked up to accident, to exhaustion, to the simple attrition of life below. Others return changed, eyes brighter, posture straighter, as though they have discovered a strength unknown to those who still bow beneath the Aquila. They say little, but when they pass in the corridors, their presence is like static in the air, unsettling and magnetic all at once. The seeds are planted, and once planted, they grow. The child who once asked his mother about prayers now finds himself repeating strange words at night, words whispered to him by a friend who returned from the tunnels with scars carved into his arms that he insists are marks of protection. The mother, who once hushed him, now finds her own lips moving in silence when she thinks no one is watching, as if the whispers have taken root inside her skull. Even the overseer, smug in his authority, notices that the lines of workers move differently now. Their eyes hold something unfamiliar, something not beaten out of them yet. The cult has not yet named itself, but it does not need a name. Hunger and despair are the soil. Whispers are the rain. Soon, something far darker will blossom. The tunnels beneath the hive are endless. Veins carved through the rockcrete centuries ago by builders whose names have long since faded from all records. Most are abandoned, filled with rusted machinery, stagnant pools of black water, and nests of vermin swollen fat on carrion. Others are still in use, maintained only enough to carry sewage, ash, or discarded promethium fumes from the manufactorum above. It is in these forgotten arteries of the city that the whispers gather strength. For here the reach of the arbites grows thin, and the priests of the ecclesiastic rarely tread. Silence reigns, broken only by the drip of...
Those who venture here do so with hearts hammering against their ribs. They carry guttering glow globes or half-broken lumen sticks, their pale light unable to pierce far enough to reveal what moves beyond. Every shadow looks like a threat. Every gust of air feels like the exhalation of something vast and unseen. But it is precisely this atmosphere that gives birth to faith of a different kind. The Imperium's cathedrals are filled with statues and hymns, their walls screaming with the certainty of devotion. Down here, faith is a trembling breath, a desperate pact made in the dark. where the only proof of divinity is the echo that answers back. The first gatherings are small. A dozen workers slip away at night, huddling in chambers slick with condensation. They light fires in broken barrels, the flames devouring scraps of cloth and garbage, and around that heat they whisper. Some bring offerings, a severed hand taken from a corpse in the gutter, a pouch of blood drained from vermin, a shard of metal etched with symbols stolen from dreams. They do not know if these offerings mean anything. They only know that when they offer them, the silence changes. The drip of water seems to pause. The air grows thicker, pressing against their chests. And in that suffocating weight, they feel something watching. Not all can endure it. Some flee, scrambling back to their hab blocks, trembling and mumbling apologies to the Emperor in case he is listening after all. But others stay. The ones who have nothing left, the ones whose children already starve, the ones whose bodies are breaking under the lash of overseers and who no longer fear death because they taste it daily, these stay. And when they kneel in the filth, when they press their foreheads against stones slick with ancient grime, they whisper back to the unseen. The first words of devotion are clumsy. The tongue of the Imperium does not lend itself easily to these prayers. Yet the shadows seem patient. They accept broken sentences, mispronounced syllables, unfinished oaths. Slowly, with each gathering, the words shape themselves into something sharper, something older. The cultists-to-be wake with symbols carved in their memory, as though painted onto their eyelids during sleep. They etch them into walls, into their own flesh, into the bones of vermin. They speak them without knowing what they mean. And still the shadows answer. One night a child wanders too close to one of these gatherings. He has followed his mother, though she did not know he trailed her through the tunnels. From the gloom he sees her kneeling before the fire, her hands cut open so blood may drip into a bowl at the center. Around her, other workers do the same, their eyes closed, their lips moving in unison with a chant that is not imperial. The boy cannot understand the words, but the sound of them makes his stomach churn and his skin crawl. He wants to cry out, to drag her away, to remind her of the Emperor's light they were told to follow. But then she lifts her face and he sees a serenity there he has never seen before. Not weariness, not fear, peace. For the first time in years she looks at rest. That sight silences him. And when she finally turns, spotting him in the shadows, she does not scold him. She simply holds out her hand, blood dripping from the cut across her palm, and whispers for him to join her. The boy steps forward, hesitant, but in that moment his path is set. Such moments multiply. Entire families begin disappearing into the tunnels together. Workers who once cursed each other for scraps now kneel side by side, bound by whisper stronger than hunger. It is no longer simply a meeting of the hopeless. It is becoming a congregation. And congregations require leaders. The first among them is not the strongest nor the most learned. He is an old worker, half blind, his spine bent from decades at the forges. He should have died long ago, but somehow he endures. When he speaks, the others listen, not because his voice is commanding, but because it is broken. Each word rattles in his throat like stones grinding, but within that rattle there is conviction. He claims he has seen visions in the black smoke above the furnace.
And soon, belief demands proof. It begins with a rat, its throat cut, and its body burned in the flames. The shadows seem to stir in approval, the smoke coiling upward as if drawn into invisible lungs. Then comes a corpse stolen from the gutter, its flesh already rotting. When its bones crack in the fire, some swear they hear laughter. At last, a worker volunteers. Broken by sickness, dying already, he kneels willingly as the blade is pressed to his chest. His scream echoes down the tunnels. But when it fades, the silence that follows is not empty. It is thick with presence. Those who hear it weep with awe, convinced they have been noticed. From that night on, there is no turning back. The cult has tasted power, and once tasted, it cannot be forgotten. The hive above never notices the shift, not at first. Life in the upper levels is too loud, too blinding, too consumed with its own hungers to care about the whispers rising from the depths. The manufactorums roar on, belching smoke and fire, and the overseers drive their laborers with lashes and shock prods, as they always have. To the eyes of authority, nothing has changed. The production quotas are met, the forges are fed, the endless wheels of the Imperium grind forward. But down below, in the veins of the city where the air tastes of rust and human ash, something has awakened. The gatherings grow bolder. No longer confined to small, secretive circles, they spread to chambers where dozens kneel in unison, their chants filling the tunnels until they sound less like words and more like the pulse of a living thing. What began as whispers has become a rhythm, and that rhythm is infectious. Men and women who once muttered oaths to the Emperor at the start of their shifts now mumble alien syllables instead, the words slipping from their tongues without thought, as though they had always known them. The rituals change as well. Once, a drop of blood was enough. Now the altars demand more. Calden, the half-blind guide, insists that strength must be proven, that the gods who listen are not moved by weakness. He speaks with the certainty of one who believes himself their mouthpiece. The Emperor takes your sweat and calls it devotion, he croaks, his spine bent, his eyes milky and blind. But the true gods demand more, for they are alive. They hunger, and only through their hunger can you be freed. His words fall like sparks on dry tinder. The faithful nod, their hollow eyes gleaming with something new. Zeal. It begins to spill into daily life. A worker strikes his overseer, not out of rebellion, but out of a quiet, almost reverent conviction. Another sabotages a production line, letting machines grind to a halt so the night may stretch long enough for him to slip away to the tunnels. The Arbites notice. Punishments grow harsher. Entire families are dragged into the streets and broken beneath shock mauls. But even as blood runs through the gutters, the cult only deepens. The faithful see their suffering not as defeat, but as proof that their gods test them. And every lash that falls drives them further from the Emperor, further from the light, further into shadow. One evening, when the hive quakes with the thunder of distant explosions, industrial accidents, the overseers claim, Calden gathers his followers for a ritual unlike any before. The chamber is vast, carved from stone that predates even the earliest records of the hive's construction. At its center lies a pit, black and bottomless, exhaling a stench that makes eyes water and throats burn.
At the peak of the chanting, two cultists drag forward a prisoner, an arbitrator, captured in an ambush days prior, beaten until his armor hangs from him in tatters. His face is a ruin of blood and swollen flesh, but his eyes burn with fury. He curses them with every step, spitting oaths of loyalty to the Emperor, vowing they will all burn for this. His words are drowned beneath the chant. Calden approaches, laying a hand upon the man's chest, and whispers something only the prisoner can hear. Whatever it is, the fire in the arbitrator's eyes falters. For a moment, doubt flickers across his features. Then the blade descends. His body is cast into the pit. The scream echoes far longer than it should, as though the abyss below stretches into eternity. When it fades, the silence that follows is suffocating. The fires gutter, the faithful hold their breath, then slowly, impossibly, the pit breathes back. A gust of air rises, foul and warm, brushing their faces like the exhalation of some vast, unseen beast. The flames surge higher, burning blue and green, and a sound reverberates through the chamber. Not words, not music, but laughter. The faithful collapse to their knees. Some weep, some claw at their faces in ecstasy. Calden stands unmoving, his arms spread wide, his ruined eyes staring sightlessly into the void. "They have seen us," he rasps, his voice shaking with triumph. "We are theirs." From that night, the cult is no longer just a gathering. It is a covenant. Each member knows they are marked, their lives no longer their own. They walk the manufactorums with fire in their veins, their whispers louder, their defiance sharper. The overseers sense it, but cannot name it. The Arbites hunt, but their quarry slips into shadows too deep to follow. And in the silence of the hive's forgotten tunnels, the laughter of unseen gods lingers, feeding on every act of devotion, growing stronger with every drop of blood spilled in their name. The hive has always been a place of smoke and ash, but now it carries something else as well, something that tastes of madness, something that smells of old buried hunger. The cultists breathe it in, and in doing so, they breathe out their humanity. The transformation does not come all at once. It seeps into the bones of the hive like damp, slow and inevitable, reshaping lives in increments so small that at first they appear harmless. Workers hum alien cadences under their breath without realizing it. Children scratch strange spirals into the grime of walls as if compelled by hands not their own. Hab-block prayers grow shorter, murmured less with reverence and more with fear, as if the emperor's name alone might draw punishment rather than protection. The cult does not rise with banners or proclamations, it grows like mold in the dark, spreading in silence until the air itself tastes of its presence. Calden becomes more than a guide, he becomes a prophet. His body wastes away, ribs sharp beneath skin, his breath rattling, yet his voice carries strength it should not possess. He speaks of visions, burning skies where gods dance in the flames, oceans of blood in which angels drown, cities of the Imperium crumbling into dust beneath taloned feet. The faithful do not question how a half-blind cripple could see such wonders, they only believe. Every word is clutched with desperation, for belief gives shape to their suffering, and suffering is all they have ever known. The rituals grow darker. No longer content with vermin or the sickly, the cult demands worthier offerings. A foreman disappears one night, dragged screaming into the tunnels. His absence is reported, but the Arbites dismiss it as drunken misadventure. The following day, his bones are found blackened in the furnace ash, arranged in the crude likeness of a sigil that no imperial record dares name. The workers who find it say nothing. They understand too well the consequences of speech. But deep in their hearts, some feel a flicker, not of fear, but of awe. It is then that the first marks begin to appear. A laborer.
The Arbites tighten their grip, patrols double, informants are paid to betray neighbors, whole hab-blocks are raided, families dragged into the streets to face summary judgment. Yet the more bodies fall beneath their shock mauls, the more the cult thrives. Death, after all, has become proof. The faithful whisper that those who perish in raids are not gone, but reborn in the warp, their souls lifted by unseen claws into realms beyond mortal comprehension. Each execution, each purge is not deterrent, but fuel. And the whispers themselves grow louder, no longer faint, no longer indistinct, they now slither into the ears of the faithful like a lover's breath. Some hear promises of strength, others vengeance. A few claim to hear their dead children laughing again in the dark. It matters a little whether these voices are hallucination or something greater. To the cultist, they are real enough to obey. The boundaries between dream and waking blur. A man dreams of fire licking across his arms, and in the morning he finds his skin blistered and marked in the exact pattern of the dream. A woman dreams of wings unfolding from her back, and though her body remains unchanged, she swears she can feel the ache of feathers pressing against her skin. The hive itself begins to warp in subtle ways. Lights flicker in tunnels that no workers have entered in decades. Doors that were once sealed grind open to reveal chambers filled with carvings too ancient to be imperial. Pools of water ripple without cause, shapes forming on their surfaces that dissolve the instant they are touched. Even the most devout of the emperor's faithful grow uneasy, for the signs cannot be denied. Something is moving beneath the skin of the city, and it is not the hand of the master of mankind. One night, during a gathering that fills an entire cavern with chanting, the air tears open. Not in great spectacle, not with fire or thunder, but with a subtle wrongness, as if the world itself falters for a breath. Shadows stretch unnaturally, the glow globes flicker blue and die. For an instant, every voice falls silent. Then, from the darkness at the cavern's center, a shape moves. It is no daemon, not yet. It is a shimmer, a distortion of air like heat rising from stone, but within it, eyes glint too many, too bright, unblinking. The faithful collapse as one, their screams dissolving into ecstasy, their bodies pressed to the stone in worship. Kalden raises his hands, his ruined eyes weeping blood, and cries out that the pact is sealed. The gods have heard, the gods have answered. When the lights sputter back to life, the distortion is gone, but the cavern reeks of burned flesh, and every cultist bears a fresh scar across their skin, the exact same mark etched in perfect symmetry. None question its meaning. They know. They have been branded. From that moment, the cult is no longer rumor. It is no longer scattered whispers in the dark. It is real, bound by blood, sealed by presence, alive in a way the Imperium would never acknowledge. And though the hive above still churns in ignorance, still blind to the storm gathering beneath its foundations, the cultists know the truth. They are no longer forgotten. They are chosen. And once chosen, there is no return. The abyss does not roar, it murmurs. That is how it begins, a low hush beneath the constant drone of the hive, a suggestion so faint that most dismiss it as exhaustion or madness. Yet for those whose hearts already crack beneath the strain of labor and hunger, the murmur lingers. It coils around their thoughts during the long hours at the furnaces, seeps into their bones when they collapse into rust-stained bunks. At first it seems no more than their own minds whispering treachery. What if the Emperor does not care? What if he never has? But the longer they listen, the more the words sharpen, becoming something distinct, something undeniably other.
The cultists are not yet named as such. They are still workers, still scavengers, still shadows slipping through the hive unseen. Yet within them, the shift is irreversible. Faith in the Imperium has long eroded. Now belief in something else begins to fill the hollow. They tell themselves it is comfort, that the voices bring calm where once there was only despair. A mother hears laughter like her dead child's in the silence of a hab-block corridor. A broken worker hears promises of strength in the hiss of leaking steam. Even when fear claws at their throats, they cannot let go, because for the first time in their lives, the darkness does not ignore them. Kalden, the half-blind prophet, becomes the interpreter of these whispers. His words, once riddled with the rasp of age, now carry the weight of certainty. He tells them that the voices are not madness, but revelation, that their suffering has drawn the gaze of powers greater than any throne-bound corpse. The Emperor may hold the galaxy in chains, but here, in the dripping bowels of the hive, gods have stooped to listen. Each whisper, he insists, is proof of their worth, a sign that they are not forgotten. The gatherings swell. Where once a dozen huddled around guttering flames, now scores fill chambers until the walls sweat with the heat of their bodies. They chant not only to summon presence, but to drown themselves in it. The voices that answer are not always kind. Sometimes they mock. Sometimes they command. Sometimes they scream in such raw hunger that blood vessels burst in the eyes of those who listen. Yet still the faithful kneel, for cruelty feels like intimacy compared to the silence of the Emperor. The rituals take on structure. Calden teaches invocations he claims were carved into his memory by the gods themselves, words that scrape like blades across the tongue, yet carry power when spoken in unison. Offerings are no longer haphazard, they are precise, chosen. The dying are brought willingly, believing their blood will ripple into eternity. The lost are guided to the knife with songs of devotion. And when their bodies are offered to the pit, the air grows heavier, the shadows stretch longer, and the whispers swell until the cavern trembles. The Arbitice notice patterns in the disappearances. Reports multiply. Overseers whisper of workers speaking in strange tongues, of tools left arranged in sigils rather than stacked in order. Patrols storm the hab blocks, dragging out suspects for interrogation. But fear has lost its sting. Those taken away go laughing, their voices raised in hymns to gods the Imperium dares not name. And those who remain only feel their faith deepen, for if the Arbitice fear them, then surely they are on the path to power. One evening, as the cult gathers, the air hums with a resonance unlike anything before. The walls of the cavern vibrate, dust sifting down like falling ash. The whispers converge, no longer fragmented, no longer scattered, but unified into a single voice that presses against every skull with suffocating weight. It does not speak in words that can be written. It speaks in hunger, in desire, in inevitability. Many collapse, convulsing. A few die outright, their hearts unable to withstand the strain. But the survivors rise changed. Their eyes gleam with unnatural light, and their voices carry a timbre that echoes faintly even when they whisper. Rumors spread of miracles. A woman lays her hands upon a sick child, chanting in a tongue that makes onlookers bleed from the ears, and the child rises whole. A worker facing punishment for sabotage endures lashes that should shred flesh, yet his wounds close before blood can flow. Skeptics scoff, claiming tricks or coincidence, but those who witness know what they saw. And the cult has crossed a threshold. It is no longer merely a refuge for the broken. It is a body, a network of breath and blood that stretches through the veins of the hive, pulsing with a rhythm not its own. And in that body, the whispers are not simply heard, they are obeyed. Calden stands at the center of it, frail as parchment yet radiant with a conviction that bends others to his will. He does not need to command. He simply speaks what he hears, and the faithful move as one. He is their prophet, their mouthpiece, their bridge to the abyss. And though his flesh weakens with every passing day, though his breath rattles with death, his presence grows stronger. Some whisper that he is no longer mortal at all, but a vessel. Yet even among the faithful, there are those who wonder. For every miracle there are horrors, faces twisted into masks of agony mid-prayer, bodies broken in ways no human hand could manage, dreams so vivid that men tear their own eyes from their sockets to stop the visions. If these are gifts, then they are gifts wrapped in torment. But who among them dares to refuse? To doubt is to invite abandonment, and abandonment is worse than death. And so the hive hums, half in prayer, half in terror, as the whispers of the void tighten their grip. The city's law does not sleep, and when it finally turns its visor to the depths, it does so with ritual efficiency. The Adeptus Arbites arrive like a storm of black carapace and vox-barked litanies, visor slits glinting in the underhive's false dawn. They bring shock mauls, suppression shields, and the certainty of sanctioned violence. With them come others on chittering metal feet, Skitari from a nearby forge enclave, augmetics whirring, sensor vanes twitching, auspex arrays tasting the air for wrongness the human tongue cannot name. Brass-piped tech priests glide behind, robes dragging grime, mechadendrites tasting the damp like curious serpents.
In the manufactoria above, production continues, presses hammering, rivets singing, furnaces exhaling promethium breath. But down here, the temperature drops. Even the sump rats feel it and flee. The arbites begin with curfews and cordons. Hab-block doors are sealed, names taken, faces scanned and compared to data slate lists inked with suspicion. Those who fail to answer questions properly are marched to holding cages, where lumen strips buzz with a sound that makes teeth ache. The sermons of the ecclesiastery grow louder again, as if more volume might crush doubt. Priests plant portable shrines, the imperial aquila bolted into rusted bulkheads with the reverence of a battlefield icon, and chant until their throats are raw. The faithful watch, some with relief, others with a new, quieter terror, because the pressure has shifted, and any movement may draw a boot. Yet the murmur continues under everything, a current beneath the surface flow. Cultists slip messages hand to hand, a cut on the left thumb identifying friend from informant, a smear of ash across the brow meaning flee, a spiral scratched with a nail meaning gather. Kalden moves through tunnels no map holds, guided by what he calls the pole. 1 step safer here, 3 steps death there. Turn left at the pipe that weeps black water, kneel when you feel the temperature change. Those who follow him survive raids by distances measured in heartbeats. Those who lag behind decorate the arbites reports with red ink and body counts. A purge sweeps a row of hab cells in the shadow.
The Skitarii take the tunnels, their optics drinking wavelengths that make human eyes weep. They walk as if they own the angles of the world, each step measured, each gesture calculated. Their vox traffic is a machine can't hiss that the ear cannot translate, and the soul does not want to. Auspex returns spike in places where the stone feels older than the hive, older than the rock that birthed it, older even than the words carved there. The tech priests pause at these nodes, cogitators purring, binary prayers ticked from vox grills, and mark the coordinates for later sanctification with blessed solvents and disciplined flame. The cult answers with sabotage that passes for chance. A valve unthreads itself, and a corridor fills with choking steam just as a patrol rounds the bend. A lumen grid blows in a corona of sparks and leaves the arbites blind for 17 heartbeats, enough for 3 figures to melt into a wall seam and become its shadow. An entire sump bridge detaches from its moorings and rolls into the black water below, swallowing the lawmen that trusted it. The reports will call this maintenance negligence. The cultists will call it favor. Some of these accidents are luck. Many are not. The whispers have grown teeth. They bite when asked. A boy, thin as wire, eyes too old for his face, presses his ear to a bulkhead and hears a voice inside the metal telling him which bolt to loosen to pull down a walkway at precisely the right moment. He does it with shaking hands and later dreams that the bulkhead had a heartbeat that matched his own. A woman with scars coiled across her ribs like vines wakes from a vision of numbers, pipe pressures, relay timings, heat flux. She scribbles them onto a rag with soot and hands them to a friend in silence. Hours later, a furnace coughs just long enough to throw a patrol off schedule and save a dozen kneeling in a side chamber, slick with condensation and hope. Kalden convenes them in a space they call the throat, a vertical chamber where 4 ancient pipes converge into a single mouth that drinks every noise and returns it hollow. He speaks of oaths, and the way his voice drops into the dark makes the hair rise along arms. The cult must change shape, he says, because the law hunts patterns and the gods love cunning. Cells will splinter, then rejoin, then splinter again, a living thing that bleeds from one wound to feed a limb elsewhere. They nod and learn roots by taste and smell. Burnt oil means south. Tang of copper means up. Fungus means you are already lost. They memorize knocks on metal, 2 short, 1 long for safe.
long, short, for run. They practice stillness until even their breath quiets. Yet for all his caution, Kaladin is not immune to pressure. He thins like smoke in a wind, and there are hours when his body seems an absence into which the murmurs pour. Those who sit near him during these spells report the sensation of being watched from behind their eyes, as if their skulls had windows. Some leave these meetings with nosebleeds that will not clot. One dies with a smile on his lips and blackness under his fingernails, the spiral he was scratching on his thigh, incomplete by a single curve. The corpse is taken to the pit with a reverence bordering on terror, and no one speaks the boy's name again. Names are fragile here. Sometimes they draw attention. The Arbites make their first public example. In a square of cracked deck plating, beneath a makeshift catechism board, they string 3 bodies by their ankles: a foreman who failed to report seditious behavior, a priest who did not denounce superstition with vigor, and a woman marked with scars no imperial pen will describe. The bodies sway in the filtered wind and knock together gently like chimes. A crowd forms and stares. Some spit. Some cross themselves and hurry away. A few linger until night. And in the dark, they whisper not prayers to Terra, but the syllables Kaladin taught, syllables that taste like iron and smoke. The next morning, the bodies are gone, and spirals are drawn where their heads dripped, as if to catch the last fall of devotion from emptied skulls. Across the hive, rumors thicken like fog. Some say a servitor stuttered mid-task and said a name no one had spoken before, then tore its own tongue out with pincers. Others swear a data slate, used for ration tallies, began scrolling symbols until its screen cracked. A tech priest is found unmoving, mechanodendrites wrapped around his own throat, as though strangled by prayer. The official notices attribute these to sabotage and stress. The underhive attributes them to attention. The difference is grammar. The outcome is the same.
Fear drives informants to the Arbites with shaking hands and eyes that cannot meet anyone else's. Some tell truths, many tell guesses. The law harvests both and plants them in interrogation rooms where lumen strips hum and the smell of hot plastic settles into hair and skin. Still, the cordons never quite catch the beating heart. It always slips, always settles 2 corridors over, always breathes from a grate in the floor no one remembered was there. On the night the Skitarii bring a portable Auspex shrine into the throat's general vicinity, the air changes. Kaladin halts mid-syllable and tilts his head as if hearing a distant chime. He raises a trembling hand and every voice stills. The murmur tightens into a line that threads his tongue and pulls it forward. He announces there will be a crossing, the first true oath, the dividing of shadow from shade. Those who step across will not be able to return to the habits of being unnoticed. Those who refuse will be permitted a lesser path of silence and drift. No one breathes while he speaks. The choice is not a choice at all, and yet bodies must choose to make the pact hold. The preparations are spare and careful. No banners, no proclamations, no foolish proclamation to draw a bolt around. Only bone dust ground from vermin and mixed with oil to paint spirals on the floor. Only a pit mouth opened with crowbars where the decking thins. Only knives cleaned on rags and placed in a circle like a clock that keeps a different kind of time. The whisper inside the metal grows clearer, a hum that carries the taste of copper across tongues. The air cools. Somewhere far above, a manufactorum bell tolls shift change, and the sound arrives down here bruised and slow, as if it had been made to crawl. They come in 1s and 2s, faces hidden beneath hoods stitched from rags, hands shaking only when no one can see. Kaladin moves to the center, not quite touching the edge of the opened black, and presses his palm to the floor. A ripple travels across the decking, visible in the gleam of thin oil, and stops beneath the feet of a boy and his mother, the same pair who once watched each other carve a life from fear. Kaladin names them both, voice barely risen, and the naming makes their bodies colder as if a shade had stepped through them.
Others are summoned by similar weight, a foreman's widow, a riveter with ruined lungs, a priest who could not bear to continue speaking words that no longer answered back. Above them, the Auspex shrine turns toward the throat like a hound testing a wind. In the tunnel leading toward the chamber, bootsteps measure distance and doctrine. The Skitari's optics flicker, recalibrating across spectra. A tech priest raises a mechanodendrite and taps a rune upon a handheld device, and its screen returns a value that makes a blessing stall on his Vox grill. 3 Arbites shift shields forward and bring shock mauls to ready. One whispers a prayer to the master of mankind, without realizing he has spoken. The sound carries, thin and lost, and reaches the edge of the black where it frays into nothing. Kalden breathes once, a long shudder that seems to draw the room smaller around his ribs, and begins the oath. The words are not loud, but they arrive as if whispered from inside every skull at once. Fingers curl, knees touch stone. The knives glint once, and then dim, as if light had decided to be elsewhere. The first cut is made, not deep, not mortal, only enough to sign in blood, and the droplets strike the decking with a sound too heavy for their size. Each strike repeats down the spirals like a chime counting something older than ours. The Auspex shrine finds its line. A signal lock ticks green. A tech priest rasps for advance. The Arbites move. Somewhere in the dark between them and the throat, a valve that no one has touched in a century decides it has been turned. Steam screams into the corridor and turns their disciplined charge into a tight, suffocating crawl. The Skitari push through, optics fogging and clearing and fogging, augmetics hissing. The Auspex flickers, regains the thread, loses it again as the temperature spikes with no source.
In the chamber, the oath reaches the word that feels like a cliff's edge. Kalden's ruined eyes bleed, twin threads of red falling to his chin. The boy sways. The mother steadies him with a hand that leaves a crimson print on his shoulder. The pit exhales a breath that smells of old coins and wet stone and something like burned marrow. The decking flexes. No one moves. For an instant the murmur stops entirely, the silence huge and exact, as if the hive itself waits to hear what they will become. The silence in the throat stretches until it feels unbearable, a weight pressing on every chest, a hand clamping over every mouth. It is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence before a voice speaks. Then, without warning, the murmur surges back, no longer faint, no longer fractured. It becomes a chorus, layered and vast, as though 1,000 unseen throats speak from the stone itself. The words are not words. They are pulses that hammer inside skulls, meaning seared directly into thought. Those kneeling scream, not all in terror, some in ecstasy, some in agony, many in both. Kalden sways, his bones trembling like reeds in a storm, and he begins to echo the sound. It pours from his throat in perfect cadence, though no human mouth should shape it. The pit exhales, a blast of air so foul that glow globes gutter into ash. The knives on the decking shiver and rise, turning as if drawn by invisible hands, their edges glinting with something wetter than light. The chosen bleed in unison, their cuts weeping onto spirals now glowing with the heat of molten metal. Above, Arbites and Skitari force their way through steam-thick corridors, closing in. Auspex readings spike to impossible levels, machine spirits shrieking in code. The tech priest intones emergency rites, binary prayers tumbling from his Vox grill. But even his lenses falter, blinking as though refusing to see what waits. The Auspex shrine overloads, its rune face cracking, symbols cascading in spirals before bursting in a spray of sparks. In the momentary darkness, the Arbites hear chanting ahead, words that sound like nothing their catechisms ever prepared them for. Back in the chamber, Kalden collapses to his knees, his blood mixing with that of the faithful, and the murmur threads itself into a single, undeniable command.
Every cultist bows until their faces grind against stone. The knives fall as one, biting deep. Blood floods the spirals, hissing as though the steel drinks it. The pit exhales harder now, rattling the decking, shaking dust from the ceiling. A shape stirs within, indistinct but vast, a shimmer of shadow against shadow, eyes glinting like embers through smoke. Some scream, some laugh, some tear at their own flesh in rapture. The oath is sealed, the cult is remade, and in that moment the underhive ceases to belong entirely to the Emperor. Something else has claimed a corner of it, and that claim is written in blood. Bootsteps thunder closer. The Arbites are seconds away. The Skitarii recalibrate their optics, pushing through steam and smoke, augmetic lungs drawing filtered air. The first shock maul crackles as its charge builds. The last human doubts of the Imperium servants evaporate as their training takes hold. They believe they are seconds from purging another nest of heresy. But inside the throat, the cultists rise, not as broken workers, but as something bound, scarred, and marked by voices no law can silence. The whispering void has spoken, and those who heard will never be silent again. The Arbites entered the throat expecting the stench of rot, the squalor of heretics cowering in filth, and the brittle courage of desperate men. What they found instead was a silence that breathed. Their boots echoed too loud against the stone, the sound rebounding as though the chamber itself disapproved of their intrusion. Shock mauls raised, suppression shields braced, they advanced into a space marked not by the aquila, but by spirals, slick with drawing.
The cultists knelt as though still in prayer, their faces smeared with blood, their eyes vacant, yet shining with something that no imperial catechism could name. To strike them down should have been simple. To arrest them, easier still. But when the Arbites advanced, the kneeling did not scatter. Instead, they rose in unison, not with weapons, but with certainty. They moved like one body. They breathed like one body. And when they screamed, the sound shattered glass in the visors of the enforcers. The first blows fell anyway. Shock mauls cracked bone. Suppression shields drove men to the floor. Las rounds from Skitarii rifles burned flesh to ash. Yet death did not break the formation. The cultists surged forward, bare-handed, hurling themselves into the storm of sanctioned violence without hesitation. They clawed, they bit, they tore at armor with nails split to the quick. They fought not for survival, but as offerings. Each life spilled was tribute, each scream a hymn. And though they fell by the dozen, they did not falter. Calden was dragged from the center, half-conscious, his blood soaking his ragged robes. The faithful shielded him with their bodies, forming a living wall of meat that the Arbites hacked apart with mechanical precision. Yet even as limbs fell and lungs collapsed, the dying pressed tighter around him, their final strength spent to protect the one they called Prophet. The Arbites pried him free in the end, binding him in chains, sanctified with litanies. But the cost was steep. Too many dead for what should have been a simple purge. Those captured were herded into cages and marched through the hive in chains. Crowds gathered to watch, some spitting, some weeping, some silently clutching the aquila at their throats with eyes full of doubt. For though the cultists were bloodied and broken, they did not hang their heads. They walked tall, whispering in voices hoarse with devotion, their lips moving in rhythm with words no one else could hear. Some burst into laughter as the Arbites struck them. Others pressed their bloodied foreheads to the cage bars and kissed the iron as if it were relic bone. To see such men and women unbowed, unnerved even the most faithful in the crowd. For in their defiance was a kind of power the Imperium rarely admitted existed. Inquisitorial agents arrived soon after. Silent figures cloaked in black, their presence enough to make Arbites stiffen and priests swallow their words.
The cultists were transferred to facilities none would name aloud, their fates sealed in interrogation chambers where screams were muffled behind wards and sanctified steel. It was there that the chains of flesh and iron closed around them fully. Their wrists were shackled, their bodies beaten, their minds scoured by psychers who tore through memory with invasive thought. Yet even under such torment, the whispers persisted. Some cultists died with lips still moving in prayer to gods unseen. Others erupted mid-questioning, flesh warping into grotesque shapes before bolt rounds reduced them to ruin. For every confession extracted, 3 more ended in silence or impossible phenomena that even the Inquisition scribes refused to catalog in full. And still the hive stirred. The executions came swiftly. Bodies burned in squares before cathedra, their ashes scattered into the sump to deny any shrine a relic. Priests declared the emperor's justice fulfilled. Overseers returned workers to the manufactorums with doubled quotas, lashing harder than before. The Arbites patrolled with heavier boots, their visors darkened to conceal the unease in their eyes. But fear is not the same as victory. For every cultist who burned, another whispered into the ear of a neighbor. For every prophet dragged into chains, another voice rose in the dark, declaring visions seen in the flicker of lumen fires. The Imperium could kill bodies. It could not kill whispers. And the whispers grew.
Children began scratching spirals in their sleep, their fingernails tearing against stone. Overseers found workers who should have been broken standing tall, their wounds knit by something not sanctioned. The air in the tunnels thickened, heavy with scents that had no place there. Copper, ash, the faint sweetness of decay. Servitors malfunctioned, repeating phrases they had not been programmed to know. Tech priests muttered of machine spirits corrupted, their binary hymns returning echoes in alien cadence. The chains of the Imperium had bound flesh, but iron cannot hold a voice. Those who escaped the purge, scattered though they were, found one another again. Not in vast gatherings, but in pairs, in trios, in cells hidden among the countless veins of the hive. They carried scars as badges, their bloodied oaths etched into memory. They whispered not of freedom now, but of purpose. Chains were no longer burdens, they were symbols. To wear them was to prove endurance, to show the gods that suffering could be transformed into devotion. They no longer prayed for release from pain. They prayed for strength to bear more. The hive had always been a prison. Now it was a crucible. They learned to wear chains as if they were vestments. Links clinked beneath rags in a rhythm that matched the murmur, wrists ringed in iron until the skin beneath calloused into wreaths. When manacles bit, they called it communion. When shackles tore skin, they called it witness. Those who had escaped the throat by inches gathered in sumplit alcoves and spoke of pain as coin, of endurance as doctrine. The boy and his mother did not speak much at all. They moved with a new economy, conserving breath for the hours when breath would matter. When patrols passed, they pressed themselves into the sweat-slick seams between pipes, counting heartbeats by the pulse in their tongues. The boy had learned to listen through metal. The mother had learned to read the way steam held a corridor, heavy or light, as if the hive exhaled warnings to those who had learned its language. The first Astra Militarum units arrived with the dull inevitability of rain in a rust season. Drab columns trundled through the arterial tunnels. Chimeras wedged sideways to bully narrow passages into roads. Dozer blades throwing up fans of sparks from rockcrete. Squads in flak armor moving 2 by 2, auspex slates flickering between hands. Vox grills coughing catechisms clipped short to make room for orders. Incense swung from field shrines bolted to hatches, smoke smearing into the air, already thick with promethium breath. The soldiers were tired from other wars and wore it like an extra piece of kit. They did not come as judges like the Arbites or as augury in flesh like the Scitari. They came as broom and fire. Purge lines were drawn on data slates with stylus tips that shook for lack of sleep.
Hab stacks were numbered for compliance checks and then renumbered after the first map failed to match the reality of centuries of accretion. A lieutenant with a bandage beneath his gorget stared too long at the spirals chalked at ankle height along a corridor and ordered them scrubbed. The cleaning crew did so until their hands bled, and when the smears refused to vanish, the lieutenant had the entire section flooded waist-deep in sump. By morning, the spirals rode the new waterline like tide marks, faint but intact, as if the hive had grown them. They took the manufactorums next. Lines of workers were herded beneath pict casters that looped sermons from the ecclesiarchy, each word translated into Low Gothic and then into the blunt grammar of the lash. Overseers, terrified of being thought lax, oversaw with zeal. Men and women who faltered were dragged to the front and offered the choice between the chain and the torch. Most chose the chain. The torch took the rest and licked the ceiling black. An attendant servitor dutifully recorded the names and the reasons, quill clicking, then spasmed once, and wrote the same symbol down the length of a page until the quill snapped. The priest administering the rite did not look at the page. He spoke the next verse louder and ordered a new servitor.
Calden learned iron and light. Iron on his wrists, light that hurt the eyes more than truth. The Inquisition moved him between rooms as if motion could erase meaning. Chains scraped. Floors were sanctified with oils that smelled of metal and hot copper. The interrogators did not shout. They asked questions like screws turn. Slow pressure, a little more, until threads bite. A psyker hovered at the end of every session, hooded, the air wobbling around him as if heat were trying to climb from cold. Calden answered in one voice and in many. Sometimes he was only breath and rattle. Other times the syllables he spoke made lumen strips flicker and auspex needles quiver like frightened birds. When the psyker reached, he felt a labyrinth. Not a locked door, not a wall, but turns upon turns that seemed to double back and open into corridors where words had been laid like traps. The second time he reached, he bled from the ears and vomited black water that was not water at all. The interrogator noted it down and changed nothing. The boy found work carrying scrap to a chute that screamed when it ate. The mother found work cleaning ash from a substation that never slept. They met in the hour that was no hour, when shift bells argued with each other and the hive forgot which clock to obey. They did not pray with words anymore. They touched foreheads and let the murmur tighten in their chests, each becoming the other's echo. When soldiers passed, they watched the way boots scuffed rust and read routes in a scatter. When a Vox unit stuttered in their hearing, they learned to feel for the next break in its rhythm and slipped through right then. The boy carried a length of chain wrapped under his sleeve like a relic. The mother had carved a spiral on the inside of her palm and kept it clean with spit and oil so it would not scar smooth. In a tunnel that sloped like a throat, a squad found a shrine. Not the Aquila, not sanctioned iconography, but a disc of hammered scrap hung with bones white as teeth. A guardsman raised his flamer and hesitated because the air in the chamber felt thin, as if the room had already been burned. The sergeant told him to fire. The igniter clicked. Nothing. He tried again, and the machine spirit sulked in stubborn silence. A psyker priest arrived and soothed with binary, patted the casing with a macadamite like a father calming a child, and when the flamer finally took, it spat an apology so hot it peeled paint from his lenses. They cleansed the chamber until heat made the air cry. Later, a worker would pass that same place and run his fingers along the blackened wall and come away with ash that smelled faintly of incense. He would mark a spiral over it with a broken fingernail and leave before the heat cooled. Rumors carried on sump fog. A penal legion draft would process through the lower stacks, shackling prisoners for shipment to a front no one could pronounce. A list would be posted and amended, then amended again when a clerk misplaced a slate, then amended again when a name wrote itself at the bottom that no one remembered adding. The boy watched the drafting with the careful blankness that keeps children alive in places that do not prioritize them.
He saw a woman step forward at the speaking of a name that was not hers and accept the collar with a calm that made soldiers look away. He saw another try to run and learn what shock truncheons do to knees. He saw a priest bless the collars and wondered what prayer made iron holy. Chains taught the loyal their creed and taught the cult its answer. The faithful clanked in processions to cathedra that smelled of soot and tallow, chanting litanies that tried to drown the unease with sound. The cultists clanked in twos and threes and learned to find rhythm in the gaps. The half-second after a bell's peal, the gasping pause between two sermon lines, the breath an arbitrator takes before he speaks an order. They became editors of silence. They cut their lives at opportune commas and survived because they knew how a sentence carries weight.
A captain of the Arbites sat alone, helm on the table, hair pressed flat by duty. His hands shook when he tried to drink recaf. He stared at the picked feed from an interrogation room where Calden's gaunt silhouette hunched beneath a lumen strip that made everything look wet. The captain had killed men before, and would again. It was not the killing that prided him, it was the way the cultists died, laughing, whispering, giving their breath to syllables that made even trained psychers blench. He told himself they were diseased. He told himself the Emperor's truth is not obliged to sound kind. He placed his palm on the table's edge and felt vibration. Not the building, not the generators, a cadence. His name, or something near it, repeated with a fondness that had no right to exist. He snatched his hand back as if burned and reached for his helm as if it could make him deaf. He would order the next purge with a voice that did not shake. He would not touch the table again. In the room without windows, Calden spoke to the chains. He named each link under his breath and told it a story, the way mothers once told their children tales of terror they had never seen. He said the links were pilgrims and the shackle a gate. And if they listened, the gate would learn to open for hunger rather than for keys. The interrogator smiled without his eyes and asked who had taught him that fiction could move iron. Calden did not look up. He told a different link a different story about a door that was not a door but a throat. The psycher reached again, because duty is a habit that wears down caution. Somewhere 3 corridors away, a lumen bank popped and died, and the darkness it made felt pleased with itself. No one recorded that feeling. No one writes down satisfaction. The boy and his mother crossed a floor where the paint had bubbled from long ago heat. Their steps made no sound because they had learned to place feet in the shallow places between echoes. Ahead, a grate sweated cold. Behind, a patrol's soft boot rubber whispered doctrine. The boy touched the chain under his sleeve and felt nothing. Not metal, not weight, only a humming like the inside of a large bell. He did not know if it came from him, or the grate, or the thing in the throat that had breathed them into becoming. He touched his mother's wrist, and she nodded, not because she knew what he felt, but because agreement is another way to survive. They slipped through the grate and into a crawl space that tasted of mold and old prayer. For a few heartbeats, they were not hunted. A work shift later, a squad brought a heavy stubber to the entrance of a sump market and set it on its tripod like an argument. Vendors packed their wares with faces that tried to be neutral and hands that could not help hurrying. A child carrying a cage of rats stopped to look at the weapon as if at a statue. The gunner checked belts, patted the feed, and felt the same bell hum through the metal that the boy had felt through his chain. He stepped back fast enough that the sergeant laughed and called him a novice. The gunner did not explain. Some sensations make fools of words. In the night that is not night below the hive, the chains learned new tricks. A shackle pin wore down as if worried by teeth. A lock's guts shifted as if seduced. A transport's door chose a bad moment to miscount its latches and opened an inch when there were too many eyes to notice. The Inquisition called for stricter rights over iron, longer litanies, thicker oils. The oils smoked sweetly. The litanies left throats raw. The iron, being iron, did not care which side claimed it. It liked being touched. It liked the attention. That was enough. An auspex in a Skitari's hand drew a spiral on its own cracked screen, and then returned to its grid. Ashamed or satisfied, it was difficult to tell. A tech priest placed a data slate on a lectern and began a maintenance benediction. Halfway through, his voice wavered into a cadence he did not recognize, and the slate displayed a list of names he had never learned. Calden's was not on it. The boy's was not either. The mother's was not there. Names appeared that did not exist until the moment they were written. The tech priest made the sign of the cog and turned off the slate and counted his mechadendrite tips twice to be sure they were still 8.
In a corridor that bent like a spine, the Arbites marched to chain gang toward a loading bay where transports hissed impatience. The prisoners shuffled with eyes set forward and mouths moving. The captain walked beside them and kept his gaze high, away from the scuffed deck where spirals had been scrubbed and still showed through like old scars. Calden was not among the prisoners. Calden was elsewhere, talking to iron. The captain told himself this was acceptable, that one prophet in a box was worth 100 nameless bodies chained together in a line. He told himself this twice, then 3 times. The deck thrummed with a rhythm that did not care for arithmetic. In the room where the chains were stories, a link finally listened. It sighed. The manacle opened not with a click but with the sound of a mouth deciding to speak. Calden lifted his wrist and the iron fell, as if relieved. He did not run. He looked up at the lumen script and waited for it to flicker. It obliged. The psyker sensed motion without seeing it and reeled back, blood slicking his teeth. The interrogator reached for a panic stud that had never failed him and found that the stud had become a bead of cold sweat on his palm. Calden stood, each breath a step toward a door that was not a door. The lumen strip above Calden's head flickered once, then died. The interrogator cursed, reaching for the panic stud again, but his hand found only his own sweat. Chains fell to the floor in a clatter too loud for so little metal. Calden straightened slowly, every joint trembling, every breath sounding like the last. Yet when he lifted his head, the room seemed smaller, as if his frail frame bent the walls inward. The psyker staggered back, blood streaking from his nose, his teeth red. His third eye fluttered open, unbidden, and saw something it could not name. He screamed without sound, throat locked, mind unspooling into static. Calden turned his face toward the one-way glass where others watched. His eyes were pits now, sockets lit by a glow too faint to cast shadows but too sharp to be mistaken for blindness. He spoke, and though no recording device captured it, every soul who heard would remember the syllables for the rest of their lives. The locks of the interrogation room began to groan. Not open, not yet, but groan like old timbers shifting under pressure. The iron strained as if eager, as if waiting to be told its role in the story. The interrogator drew his bolt pistol and leveled it, hands shaking. He fired once, the round stopped in the air between them and dropped to the ground like a stone that had forgotten how to fly. Calden stepped forward, his bare feet leaving prints in sweat that glimmered faintly with a spiral sheen. Far away, in the sump crawl where the boy and his mother hid, a grate rattled without being touched. The boy pressed his hand to the chain under his sleeve and felt it hum like a plucked string. The mother pulled him closer, eyes wide in the dark, listening to a silence that did not belong to silence at all. Somewhere above, bells tolled for shift change, but the sound reached them bent, distorted, stretched thin like flesh pulled too far. And in the throat, where blood had dried and spirals had dulled, the stone shivered once, as if remembering what had been promised. The hive had always been a place of noise, a cacophony of furnaces and gears, of overseers barking orders, and servitors grinding metal in endless shifts. Yet now the sound carried a discordant undercurrent, as if every clang of hammer on steel and every sigh of pistons echoed with notes that did not belong to human industry. The Arbites called it hysteria,
The ecclesiarchy called it heresy, but the workers, and even those who had never knelt in the throat, whispered another word: hymn. It began subtly. A riveter working a 12-hour line tapped his tool in rhythm and found others down the row matching him unconsciously, their blows sinking until the factory floor itself seemed to chant. In hab blocks, the lullabies mothers hummed to children drifted into strange cadences, their tones slipping off familiar scales into something older, stranger. Priests noticed worshippers answering responses before the litanies had been spoken aloud, as though words already hung in the air, waiting for tongues to catch them. The hymn grew fractured because it was never whole. Each voice carried only shards, a sequence of numbers here, a jagged half-phrase there, a hum that bent into dissonance before resolving in silence. Alone, they seemed meaningless. Together, they formed patterns too large for the human ear to hold. Some said it was nothing more than a contagion of thought, a madness carried not by blood but by sound. Others swore it was proof the gods were speaking through the hive itself, turning its bones into an organ pipe and its breath into song. The boy heard it in his sleep. Chains rattled in his dreams, forming rhythms that aligned with the drip of condensation from the ceiling. His mother stroked his hair as he shivered, whispering reassurances she did not believe. She heard it too, in the scrape of her broom across the sump station floor, in the hiss of valves that seemed to exhale her name in syllables stretched too thin. They tried to silence it with prayer, mouthing the words of the imperial creed until their lips split. But the fractured hymn did not cease. It simply folded their prayers into its measure, bending them until even those words belonged to the same strange song. Calden, though shackled in cells drenched with incense and lit by lumen strips sanctified daily, breathed the hymn like air. He did not hum it, he did not chant it, he simply opened his mouth and the sound came forth, unbidden, without effort. Guards assigned to his chamber reported headaches that lasted for hours after their shifts, ears that rang with phantom tones long into their sleep. A few began to whistle tunelessly, without realizing the notes matched those that leaked from Calden's throat. When interrogators pressed him for meaning, he gave none. He only smiled through broken teeth and asked if they truly wished to know the lyrics. The Inquisition panicked in silence. Reports vanished from data slates before they reached archives. Vox units stuttered, carrying fragments of the hymn across channels meant to be secure. Psychers tasked with damping the resonance bled from their eyes and begged to be put down. Still, the hymn spread, not as words or ideas, but as resonance, something felt more than heard. It sank into metal, rode vibrations along pipes, hid itself in the gears of manufactura. And every worker, every arbitrator, every priest who brushed against it became a note in the fractured score. It was not unity, it was infection. Yet for the faithful, infection felt like belonging. For the desperate, it felt like purpose. For the broken, it felt like home. The hymn bred counter-hymns. Priests dragged harmonizers into squares and struck tuning forks over braziers until the metal sang a sanctioned pitch. Choirs of novices bellowed responses meant to smother the wayward cadence beneath tides of creed. In manufactorums, overseers set klaxons to pulse at irregular intervals, hoping to break patterns before they formed. The Astra Militarum piped marching beats through vox horns and ordered squads to keep step, boots drumming doctrine into rockcrete. Tech priests stood before reverberation charts projected in sear green and argued about phase cancellation, their mechadendrites sketching sinusoids in incense smoke like scribes diagramming a prayer. For an hour here and a half shift there, it seemed to work. Notes slipped, pulses lost their grip. Then the fractured hymn would return altered, having learned the counters, incorporating the klaxons as if it had always owned them, swallowing the marching cadence until even the soldiers' hearts seemed to thud on its offbeats.
Calden's cell moved twice in one day. Shackles were doubled, rivets blessed, lumen strips replaced with candles set in circles of salt. The guards did not speak his name. They had been told not to, in case syllables could be hooks. He sat with his head bowed and let the hymn pass through him like wind through a grate. When the interrogator asked how long it would continue, Calden smiled the tired smile of a man who has outlived too many answers and said that songs end when voices tire, and the hive had only just found its breath. The psyker assigned to monitor resonance sketched spirals in condensation on the wall and did not remember doing so. Later, a scribe erased the sketch with a sleeve and could not say why his hands would not stop shaking. In the sump market, vendors tried to bargain without rhythm. They tapped counters at random, clapped hands off time, counted coin aloud in primes, anything to avoid being folded into the pattern. Still, the hymn found them. Rat cages rattled in sync. Knives set to one side for gutting fish pointed tip to hilt like notes on a stave. A woman bit into recycle bread and swore the crunch matched the chime of a broken lumen. She spat it out, and it still chewed in her ears. At the edge of the market, an ecclesiarchal deacon climbed a crate and raised a vox-hailer, but his voice slurred at the end of every line until his sermon rhymed without permission. He threw the hailer as if it were to blame. It landed ringing, exactly on the beat he had been trying to escape. The boy learned the hymn's alleys. It did not own every corridor at once. It moved like weather, pooling here, thinning there. He tasted it on the back of his tongue, tin and old rain, then tugged his mother's sleeve and led her 3 doorways left to where breathing felt like it belonged to them again. They taught one another small rescues, how to cough at a wrong moment to throw off a refrain, how to step on the hinge side of a deck plate so it would complain against the meter, how to hum a single flat tone through clenched teeth like a splinter in song. None of it broke the hymn, some of it made space inside it. That was enough to sleep, sometimes. A Mechanicus choir arrived from the Forge Enclave, robed in red that drank the sumplight. They carried harmonic sensors and rang them in binharic intervals no human larynx could hold. Machine cant rolled from their vox grills in chords that made teeth ache. For a span of moments, the manufacturum floor calmed, presses sighed out of time again, rivets fell dumb. Workers knelt in relief they did not dare name, and tech priests marked a dozen rites as efficacious. Then the fractured hymn bowed as if in courtesy and replied in the same tongue, a rippling lattice of numbers that tasted like copper and old code. Auspex needles pegged hard. 2 junior engine seers dropped to their knees, hands clamped to ears that no longer belonged to flesh. The choir fell back in perfect order because orders are what remain when comprehension flees. Their magos murmured that the machine spirits were listening to the wrong cathedral and set about re-sanctifying the rivet lines one by one with strokes as careful as calligraphy. The arbites tried silence. They declared quiet hours where no speech was permitted and punished violators with isolation, not because words carried treason, but because sound had become a weapon they did not understand. Habstacks fell into hush. Even infants seemed to learn the new law and cried inwardly, faces screwed to purple without a wail. In the stillness, the hymn grew subtler, insinuating itself into breath and pulse. A captain walked the cordon with helm on and hands behind his back, daring the rhythm to find him. It did, in the soft click of a knee servo motor he had never noticed before. He stopped walking until the tremor in his hands stilled, then ordered all patrollers to vary their stride at random. The order helped until it didn't. Randomness is only a pattern with a longer tail. Rumors, which had always been the currency of the underhive, came spent and came still spending. Some swore they had seen the imperial Aquila on a shrine ripple like a bird ruffling its feathers to a cadence no bell had tolled. Others whispered that a vox speed left on a hook began to hum the lullaby of a world its wearer had not seen since childhood. There were those who said the hymn came from the warp itself, slipping through the cracks between notes, that it was not sung but dreamed by powers who needed no lungs. Priests answered that such talk was blasphemy twice over, first for limning chaos, second for giving it poetics. The boy listened to both sides and kept his eyes on exits. The mother listened to neither and mapped which drains sang louder when the hymn thickened, because water obeys physics even when men do not.
Calden's candles guttered and went out at once, not from draft, but from agreement.
In the last smear of light, he looked as if carved from the same salt that circled him. The door magnified its hinges' complaint, then fell quiet without opening. A voice spoke from behind the steel. No words, only the sensation of a door remembering it was once a mouth. And Calden laughed low, not in mockery, not in triumph, but in recognition. He pressed his cracked lips to the cold seam, and the seam warmed against him like skin. Guards outside shifted, unsettled by how their own breath seemed to echo on the wrong side of the metal. The psyker on duty rubbed his temples and saw for an instant the cell as a throat, and the corridor beyond as the space where a song swells before it breaks. The Astra Militarum staged counterpoint. In a wide conduit dubbed the Long Hall, they erected field shrines at intervals and set squads to chant overlapping litanies, each platoon offset by a bar so the hymns knit into a net. For a while, sound held. The fractured hymn pressed and could not find a seam. Soldiers stood straighter, flat collars rasping, hands steady on lass rifles. Then a vendor's cart squealed a complaint down the hall, and every shrine candle fluttered in agreement. The net bowed, caught, and tore. The song rushed in like floodwater under a door. Men did not break, because soldiers are taught not to, but their eyes went glassy with effort, and one by one they began to match the offbeat without knowing. The lieutenant with the bandage beneath his gorget removed it and found the gauze inscribed with a neat spiral in dried blood that was not his. He wound it back on and pretended he had not seen. When the hymn crested, small things appeared to decide. A deck grating lifted by a finger's width, enough for a boot to catch. A latch refused to lift until a pursuer's timing faltered. A chain hung on a hook swayed against gravity, tapping time no human ear had chosen. The boy and his mother learned to wait for those micro-choices, to step when the world seemed to want them hidden. In a corridor lit by a single angry lumen, they paused as a prayer wheel spun without hands, ticking off the creed in clacks. When it slowed, they moved, and when it sped, they held. And so they crossed a space patrolled by men who never turned their heads because the song asked their attention elsewhere. And somewhere beneath the sum of it, the klaxons, the counter-hymns, the sanctioned silences, and the unbidden cadences, the throat remembered its promise. Dust fell in a soft ring where no foot had stepped. The pit breathed once, like a sleeper turning. On a wall long since blackened, a mark brightened, not with light, but with attention, as if the hive had opened an eye. The fractured hymn did not stay confined to workers' lips or hidden shrines. It spread upward, bleeding into levels where once only sanctioned prayers echoed. The Arbites heard it in the metallic rattle of their own suppression shields, the soldiers in the whine of their last packs charging, the priests in the pauses between their litanies. At first they mistook it for fatigue, the tricks of overworked ears, but then whole squads began marching in unison with cadences they had not been ordered, lips moving silently, eyes glazed as though listening inward. The hymn was no longer a thing overheard, it was a thing inhabiting. Calden remained the axis. Though caged and shackled, though his ribs pressed like cage bars against parchment skin, his breath came in patterns that others matched without knowing. Guards rotated hourly, yet each shift reported the same, voices repeating phrases they had never learned, fingers drumming the same jagged rhythm against thighs. Some scrawled spirals on their armor without realizing. Others, in desperation, stuffed wax into their ears, but still the song reached them, resonating in pulse and marrow, beyond sound itself. The boy and his mother lived on the edge of this storm. They had learned to walk its currents, to breathe with it when breathing against it grew too hard. The boy felt it now in the walls, pipes humming as if carrying a choir, grates exhaling syncopated sighs. His mother watched him carefully, worried by the light in his eyes, the way his lips shaped syllables he had not been taught. Yet she did not stop him. She feared silence more than she feared the song. Silence was absence. Silence meant the Emperor's gaze had never fallen here. At least the hymn looked back.
The hive groaned like a living instrument.
A cathedral of steel and stone played by hands no one could see. To the Imperium, it was corruption. To the cult, it was proof. To those caught between, it was terror with the taste of inevitability. For the fractured hymn was no longer fractured. It was learning itself whole. The hymn climbed walls like mold, filling cracks with resonance until every surface seemed to vibrate faintly under touch. Entire manufactorum floors found themselves moving to its cadence. Hammers fell together, presses sighed at once. Even the great furnaces roared in rhythm, as though the industry of the hive had been suborned into worship. Overseers lashed harder, screaming for variance, but their lashes fell on beats that matched the rhythm, their shouts breaking into refrains. Some wept when they realized it, choking on fear, while others stopped fighting and let their voices join, trembling but grateful to belong to something vast enough to notice them. Priests thundered from cathedral pulpits, but even their sermons bent. A deacon, mid-oration, suddenly broke into laughter that matched a cadence no hymn book held, then collapsed with blood streaming from his ears. The aquila above his head cracked across its wings, the fracture line curling into a spiral. The congregation fled in panic, only to find their own feet striking stone in eerie unison, the sound echoing down corridors long after they scattered. The ecclesiarchy forbade further services in the underhive, citing contamination. But without sanctioned voices, the fractured hymn only grew louder. Calden's chamber became a resonant heart. Chains quivered around him, rattling though untouched, each vibration a note in the greater chord. Interrogators demanded meaning, desperate to transcribe words where there were none. Calden only whispered that the hive itself was learning to sing, and that it would not stop until all who lived within its skin had been made into choir. They beat him for blasphemy, but every strike landed like punctuation, falling into rhythm, accentuating rather than silencing his words. The boy began hearing patterns no one else heard. He would stop suddenly in a tunnel, tugging his mother's sleeve, and a moment later a patrol would pass where they would have been. He traced spirals on rust with one finger, not absent-mindedly, but as though solving equations only he could see. His mother feared he was becoming like Calden, a vessel, but she also knew they lived because of him. She told herself she would guide him, protect him, keep him tethered. Yet in the pauses of her own heart, she realized she too had begun humming, her voice a faint thread weaving itself into the whole. The fractured hymn was no longer merely sound. It was atmosphere, contagion, inevitability. And somewhere deep below, in the hollow of the throat, the stone trembled with each refrain, waiting like a mouth about to open. The fracture widened into revelation. Where once the hymn had been scattered, breaking into fragments and echoes, now it gathered itself, coalescing into phrases that felt almost like speech. Workers on the line froze mid-task, rivet guns drooping in their hands as syllables slid into their ears. Not in Low Gothic, not in any tongue taught by priests or commanders, but in something older, rougher, a language that did not ask to be learned so much as remembered. Men and women who had never met mouthed the same jagged words at the same time, their eyes clouded, their throats raw from repetition.
The Arbites attempted to drown it once more, blaring orders through vox amplifiers, but the machines stuttered and carried the hymn instead. Their commands warped into a chorus that rolled through habstacks like thunder. The Astra Militarum drilled their squads with martial chants, yet half the soldiers slipped into syncopations that were not theirs, boots slamming down not on the mark of their sergeant's bark, but on the deeper beat pulsing through the hive. Even the Skitari faltered. Auspex arrays returned looping spiral patterns, and their machine cant responses came out inverted, as though the hymn had reprogrammed the logic of their own tongues. Calden, still shackled in his sanctified cell, laughed until his voice broke. He told his unseen listeners that the hive had always been a choir, that the Imperium had silenced it with steel and doctrine, but that silence could not last forever. The hymn was the truth beneath truth, the resonance of gods ignored too long. His laughter bent into coughing, blood flecking his lips, but even the coughs landed in rhythm, and the guards who dragged him upright found themselves tapping their own boots in time. The boy no longer resisted. He sang softly under his breath, syllables strange and broken, yet beautiful in their dissonance. His mother tried to hush him, but her own lips quivered with the same notes, as if her voice knew before her mind admitted it. They walked together through tunnels that hummed with vibration, their shadows rippling on walls alive with sound. And when the fractured hymn swelled, their steps did not falter. They belonged. The hive itself seemed to wait, every pipe and grating and lumen a string drawn taut, trembling with anticipation. What would happen when the fractured hymn found its full shape? None could say. But all could feel it coming, a storm of sound rising in silence before the break. The hymn did not end. It bent inward, as if the hive had taken a breath. For days, the rhythm faded to a low hum beneath the manufactorum's din, a ghost tone trembling through girders and pipework. Soldiers relaxed fractionally. Priests dared to return to pulpits. Arbites wrote reports declaring stability restored. But those who had listened longest knew better. The silence was not absence. It was intake, the pause before exhalation, the moment a voice gathers itself to speak. Calden felt it most keenly. Shackled, broken, ribs like cage bars, he tilted his head to the ceiling and whispered, "It is listening." Guards struck him down, but even as his teeth cracked against the floor, he smiled through blood. In the quiet after their boots retreated, the walls breathed back, dust spiraling upward, though no wind stirred. The hymn was waiting for its answer. The boy could not sleep. Every time his eyes closed, he dreamed of the pit in the throat, but no longer empty, no longer just darkness. He dreamed of a surface like oil stirred by unseen hands, glints of light burning and fading, shapes half-formed, never whole. Each morning he woke with his throat raw, his mother's arms wrapped tight around him, her face hollow with fear she could not voice. She too heard it, though she prayed otherwise, the slow, rising call that was not call at all, but response. Whispers spread like plague fire. Workers claimed to hear voices rising from the sump beneath their barracks, voices that matched the fractured hymn, but deeper, heavier, as though sung by throats larger than any human chest could hold. A patrol vanished in the lower levels, leaving behind only scorched spirals on the rockcrete and helmets cracked inward as if something had pressed down upon their skulls from above. The ecclesiarchy forbade descent into the throat, walling off its access with wards and sigils, but the wards blackened, the sigils twisted, and by morning the barriers were gone, as though the stone itself had swallowed them.
The Arbites prepared another purge. The Astra Militarum assembled, tanks groaning as they forced themselves into the narrow arteries of the hive. Tech priests read auspex screens that flickered with unreadable glyphs, and psychers bled from the eyes when ordered to scry.
Yet still they marched, because the emperor demanded obedience, and because fear left them no other choice. But even as they advanced, their boots fell in rhythm, unbidden, every step echoing the hymn they sought to silence. The abyss had heard, and now it would answer. The first voice rose from the pit like heat, warping the air without sound. Men felt it in their teeth and knees. Lumen strips flickered and steadied as if deciding whether to see. The hymn that had taught the hive to breathe found its mirror in a tone so deep it seemed to vibrate inside bone. The Arbites on the forward line braced shields by reflex. Their sergeant shouted the catechism of suppression and heard his own words return to him bent into a cadence that did not belong to his tongue. A guardsman with a flamer stepped forward and discovered that the pilot light, so faithful to the Emperor's rites of ignition, bowed and guttered as though listening. He struck the igniter again. The machine spirit took, not in defiance, but in agreement. And the gout of fire that answered curled downward into the pit as if drawn by appetite. Calden stood in his cell and did not pull against his shackles. He felt the answer pass through the stone, a pressure that stroked iron like a remembered name. The chain on his wrist twitched once, not to loosen, but to greet. He whispered to the wall, telling it the story he had prepared for this hour, a tale of doors that thought they were mouths, and mouths that learned to speak stone. No words came back. Words were too small. Instead, the room inhaled, and his lungs followed, and for a second he wondered if he had ever breathed of his own will at all, or if he had merely practiced the hive's habit until it chose to borrow him. The boy and his mother stood at the edge of a balcony that overlooked a drop into pipes the size of cathedral aisles. The air below shimmered, not with heat, but with density, like water trying to remember it was once air. He gripped her hand and felt their pulses stumble into unison, then into a rhythm that matched the tremor in the metal beneath their boots. He did not sing. He did not have to. The hymn rose around them, less a song than a pressure, a shaping. He leaned forward as if listening to a secret the world had been reluctant to tell. His mother pulled him back with a motion that was kinder than fear, and in that motion she realized she was already standing between him and the drop like a note between two others, a held tone preventing a chord from breaking wrong. In the throat, the first ranks of Astra Militarum set their tripods and swept beams of white light across the pit. The beams bent as if refracting through glass that was not there. A tech priest voxed a warning in crisp Bin Herrick and had the message returned to him half a second before he sent it, perfect and wrong, the sort of temporal fold that makes even augmetic hearts stutter. The lieutenant with the bandage beneath his gorget peeled it away to wipe sweat he would not admit to, and found that the gauze had darkened, not with blood, but with oil. He wound it back on because men in charge dressed their wounds and faced their orders. He signaled the advance. The first shapes were only distortions, heat haze without heat. The second had edges, but no agreement. Each eye saw different angles as if perspective had ceased to be communal. The third were not shapes at all, but decisions the world made, abrupt and physical. A lasbolt aimed true met a piece of air that had learned to turn and bent wide enough to score a spiral into the wall. A shock maul descended and slowed inside motion, going syrup-thick, landing an hour later as a tap on stone that made the wielder weep from the delay. A Vox amplifier spoke a command and then choked on laughter in a voice that sounded like the amplifier's own ancestor.
The Arbites do not break easily. They locked their shields and made a wall in the old way, faith and training laid like bricks. The wall held because it was a shape even the new geometry respected. They pushed, meter by meter, toward the pit, and for a moment doctrine won. Then a single shield sang, not a tone any man would choose, but one that matched the low answer rising from the black. The man behind it staggered, not with fear, but with recognition, and before his sergeant could strike him back to sense, 3 more shields trembled in sympathy.
The wall did not fall. It softened. The hymn entered the cracks that discipline leaves in any human line. Calden's chains loosened, not by opening, but by forgetting they were tight. He slid his wrists free with the care of a man unwrapping a relic. He did not run to the door. He set the iron on the floor, link by link, each laydown a syllable of a prayer that had no book. He listened for the tread of boots and heard only breath, his own, the guards outside, the building's great lungs. He said the boy's name without saying it, letting the thought move along metal, trusting that attention travels the way sound does, even through walls and wrongness. The boy flinched as if a moth had brushed his ear. He turned his head toward a corridor he had never walked and knew its path like a memory he had not earned. His mother asked nothing. Questions cost time and privacy both. They moved. The hymn thickened to their left. They turned right. A prayer wheel spun until its clacks blurred into a tone that shoved them down a stair they would have missed. A locked grill rattled once, and then decided it had been unlocked all along. The boy's chain slipped in his sleeve with the contentment of a tool taken to its proper task. The abyss answered without uncoiling anything a man could sketch. Not a daemon, not a shape with claws and a name to die cursing, but a principle taking breath, a pressure given appetite, a choir discovering a solo. In the manufactorum above, a press halted mid-stroke and held for 37 heartbeats while workers stared, and then descended with such exact grace that it stamped an imperial stamp in perfect spiral on a plate meant for tank armor. A scribe in a cathedra wrote a word he did not know, then blacked it out until the parchment tore and would not stop shaking until dawn. A child put her ear to the floor and said, with an authority that should not fit in so small a throat, that the city was saying yes. In the throat, the lieutenant gave the order he had been bred and trained and paid to give. Flamers roared, las rifles spat, grenades thumped, the old liturgy of purgation sung in fire and recoil. The pit drank. Flames curved, smoke sank, the sound of the blasts returned inverted, like a bell struck under water. Men remained men in the face of it. They reloaded, adjusted sights, altered angles, prayed the litanies that oil the joints of the human will. The answer did not gloat. It simply continued, patient as geology, inevitable as rust. Calden walked to his door and found that the door had remembered it was a passage. He stepped through and into a corridor where two guards lay slumped, not dead, not harmed, just asleep in the way a switch is off. He touched neither. He did not thank whatever had chosen this mercy aloud. Thanks are also hooks, and he needed his breath. He moved away he had taught the faithful, by the hinge side, in the shallow places between echoes, listening for the turn in the hymn where movement is a consonant rather than a break. The boy and his mother arrived at a junction where three tunnels argued. The hymn bent toward one, and the stale draft of old incense breathed from another, and down the third came the disciplined thud of men who would not admit their fear even to the inside of their teeth. The mother laid a hand on her son's head, and felt, under the sweat and hair, the skull of a child who had learned a city's rhythm and a god's idea in the same season. She said, "Now," and the word found a beat to ribe. They slipped into the scene between note and response and were gone, just as the squad came through the space where they had been.
Above, a bell tolled. It was small, a maintenance chime that marked a pressure drop in a feeder line. Still, the sound carried. It rolled through pipes and across decks like a pebble sending rings through a black pool, and when it reached the throat, the answer rose an octave. Men flinched. A priest somewhere made the sign of the Aquila and did not realize his hand had drawn a spiral first. The abyss was not a maw, it was an ear, and now that it had heard, it would not forget. The abyss pressed upward, an unseen tide filling every cavity of the hive. The hymn no longer needed mouths. It resonated in bulkhead, in pipe, in stone, in marrow. Soldiers at the throat fired blind into the black, laze bolts vanishing as if light itself had been swallowed. A flamer squad unleashed promethium in arcs so wide they seared their own boots, but the fire folded back on itself, spiraling downward in patterns too exact to be accidental. The men screamed litanies as they burned, their voices breaking into harmonies they could not have rehearsed. Calden walked free of his cell, barefoot, every step a note. The corridors did not resist him. Hatches opened as though glad to serve, lumen strips brightened in rippling waves, and incense smoke from abandoned shrines curled to shape his passage. He was not triumphant, he was weary, hollow-eyed, his frame trembling with each breath, yet he moved as though the hive carried him, as though he had become the message rather than the messenger. Those who glimpsed him from shadow fell to their knees, not out of choice but compulsion, and when he lifted a hand in silence, they pressed their foreheads to the steel. The boy and his mother descended lower than they had ever dared. The air grew thick, warm, tasting of metal and oil and old prayers left too long unspoken. She tried to shield him, but he walked ahead, lips moving, eyes distant. He was not repeating the hymn now, he was answering it, murmuring words too faint to catch, as though speaking into the ear of the abyss itself. The metal beneath their feet thrummed with every syllable, a heartbeat larger than any world. His mother's fear curdled into awe. She could not tell whether she held her son's hand or whether the abyss had reached through him to hold hers. Above, bells that had not tolled in centuries rang at once, each at a different pitch, weaving a chord so immense it rattled glass on upper spires. Nobles spat wine across banquet tables, thinking it thunder. Tech priests scrambled for explanation, their augury screaming with impossible readings. The Adeptus Arbitus called for planetary cordon, though their words broke as the vox carried only echoes. The ecclesiarchy wailed that a god had been born or awakened or remembered. None could agree, and none could stop listening. The abyss had answered, and the hive itself was its tongue. The last purge broke on the rim of the throat like surf on cliffstone. Grenades fell and did not detonate, held in stasis by a rhythm that refused release. Bayonets thrust into air that thickened to glass, snapping blades as though punishing impatience. Whole platoons vanished into the haze, not destroyed but consumed into silence, their absence noted only by the faint drift of helmets rolling back to rest at the pit's edge. The commanders barked orders into Vox units until their throats bled, but every syllable stretched, bent, and returned with a resonance that did not belong to the Imperium. Calden reached the lower galleries. He did not descend so much as arrive, carried by corridors that had become hallways of pilgrimage. The chains he had worn now trailed behind him like relics, each clink a syllable folded into the greater hymn. He raised his hands not in benediction, but in surrender, and the metal around him flexed, groaned, and stilled, as if waiting for him to speak. He whispered only, "Listen." The word was too small for the abyss, yet it carried, echoing downward until it vanished into depths that breathed in reply.
The boy stood at another balcony, his mother clinging to him, her nails pressed half-moon scars into his arm. He leaned forward, unafraid, watching the black ripple as if it were water disturbed by invisible breath. His lips moved, syllables spilling, and though his voice was soft, the hive shook with each one. The abyss was not roaring, not shrieking, but harmonizing, a resonance so vast it made the stars beyond steel feel suddenly close, as though the void itself had bent down to hear. Across the hive, machines fell silent, forges halted mid-stroke, cranes froze with their loads suspended, and even the data slates of administratum scribes flickered blank. It was not destruction, it was listening. The abyss had demanded quiet, and the world obeyed. For a single moment, the entire hive breathed as one, and in that breath was the terror of unity and the rapture of being heard. The hymn was no longer fractured, it was whole. The abyss spoke without words. Its voice was pressure and rhythm, a pulse that bent steel and marrow alike. Men fell to their knees, some weeping, some laughing, some clawing their own ears bloody to stop the sound that was not sound. Laser rifles clattered to the floor, forgotten tools in hands that shook as though straining to hold prayers too heavy for mortal tongues. The Astra Militarum, drilled to die in the Emperor's name without hesitation, now froze mid-command, their officers' lips shaping orders no soldier could obey. Calden opened his arms, chains trailing from his wrists like punctuation, and the hymn poured through him. His ribs rattled with every breath, his eyes burned with tears that were not his own. He was no prophet, no chosen one, only a vessel cracked enough to let the tide seep through. "It remembers us," he rasped, his voice breaking on the edge of song. "It has always remembered." Around him the faithful collapsed into bows so deep they resembled corpses laid in neat rows, and still the abyss pressed higher, carrying its answer into every hidden artery of the hive. The boy stared down into the black and saw not shapes, but intentions, ripples of hunger, spirals of invitation, the curve of something vast drawing breath to match his own. He raised a trembling hand as if to greet it. His mother pulled him back, tears streaking grime from her face. "No," she whispered, but even her refusal bent into the cadence, her voice a thread woven against her will into the whole. She clutched him to her chest, yet she could not silence the tremor in her bones, the part of her that wanted to belong. Above, the hive's bells tolled again. This time they did not stop. Every level, from spire to sump, rang with a chord that seemed to crack the air itself. Statues of the Emperor shuddered, some wept rust, others crumbled entirely, their stone dust settling in spirals across temple floors. The Arbites fell into disarray, their lines broken not by force of arms but by the compulsion of rhythm, shields locked in patterns that no drill sergeant had taught. Priests clung to pulpits, screaming litanies that ended as laughter, and tech priests convulsed as their mechadendrites twitched to alien tempos. The abyss did not rise as flesh or form. It rose as certainty, a truth that could not be ignored, a song that made mockery of silence, and in that certainty lay the ruin of faith and the birth of something else.
The certainty spread like fire beneath skin, unseen but undeniable. The hymn no longer echoed. It lived in every heartbeat, every ragged breath, every shiver that ran through the hive's bones. Soldiers who had sworn oaths before banners and saints found those same oaths unraveling on their tongues, syllables curling into alien refrains. Priests beat their fists against their own temples, begging the emperor to drown it out, yet the creed itself faltered, its words hollow when set against the vastness of the abyss's reply. Calden fell to his knees, his body convulsing as if torn between exultation and death. Blood streamed from his mouth, but it was not coughing, it was laughter broken into song. His voice cracked yet carried, every fracture mirrored by the stone around him. "You hear it," he whispered, though his whisper thundered in every ear. "You cannot deny it. We are chords in its breath. We are the silence it has chosen to break." His eyes burned like dying coals, and even those who despised him wept, unable to tell whether they were grieving or worshiping. The boy trembled, caught between awe and terror. The abyss answered him most clearly, not with sound, but with attention, a gaze without eyes. He felt it in his bones, in the marrow of who he was, as though the world itself leaned down to ask, "Will you sing with me?" His lips parted, syllables spilling without thought, words his mother did not recognize yet felt in her blood. She pulled him close, her tears hot against his hair. She prayed, begged, pleaded in silence, but her prayer bent as well, each plea curving toward the same spiral. Across the hive, machinery awoke, not with sparks or smoke, but with resonance. Vox units broadcast nothing but the hymn. Auspex screens pulsed spirals instead of data, and servitors twitched in unison as if awaiting command. Even the stars beyond the hive seemed to flicker, their light bending as though the void itself strained to listen. For the first time in centuries, the silence of the abyss was broken, and what had been fractured was now whole, immense, and hungry. The abyss had answered, and the hive, in all its steel and suffering, sang back.